with government on our behalf, and all our condolences and love to him and his family on this occasion. Naveen has been ill for a bit, on and off. He had a bleed in his brain and he'd gone into hospital. He was doing much better, but sadly, in the morning today, he passed. So please join Namita, William, myself, all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts in a minute of silence to pay tribute to our former Chief Election Commissioner and advisor to the Geopolitics Festival, Naveen Chawla. I'm going to take a photograph of everybody just standing and send it to their family because I said this is something that we wanted to do. Thank you so much. Back to the panel.
Thank you so much, Sanjoy. Ladies and gentlemen, our next session at Front Lawn is Geopolitics, Turmoil in West Asia, presented by ThePrint. The unfolding tragedies in the Middle East have hurt, divided, and polarized the world. Drawing on lessons from history, this distinguished panel explores the impact of past alliances, conflicts, international law, the failure of diplomacy, and potential solutions toward building a sustainable, resilient, and cohesive global future. Our speakers include Lindy Cameron, who has been British High Commissioner to the Republic of India since April 2024. Previously, Cameron was CEO of the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre. Following more than 2 decades of international development, national security policy, and crisis management. Before that, she served as Director General in Northern Ireland and as Director General of Country Programs at the Department for International Development. Kevin Kelly is ambassador to India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and the Maldives. Previously, he was Ireland's ambassador to the Netherlands and Uganda and head of press at the Department of Foreign Affairs. Kelly is a board member of the Trust Fund for Victims at the International Criminal Court with vast experience in diplomacy and education. Gideon Levy is an Israeli journalist and author. Levy writes opinion pieces and a weekly column for the newspaper Haaretz that often focuses on the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories. Levy has won prizes for his articles on human rights in the Israeli occupied territories. In 2021, he won Israel's top award for journalism, the Sokolov Award. Selma Dabbagh is a British Palestinian writer and lawyer. Author of Out of It, a novel which is set mainly in Gaza, Selma writes short stories and radio plays for the stage and on screen. She is the editor of We Wrote in Symbols, Love and Lust by Arab Women Writers. A judge for the EBRD Literature Prize 2025, she also blogs regularly for the London Review of Books. Today, they are in conversation with Navdeep Suri, who served as India's ambassador to the UAE and Egypt and High Commissioner to Australia. He writes regularly on the Middle East and foreign policy. His acclaimed translations of his grandfather Nanak Singh's work include Hymns in Blood and A Game of Fire, as well as Kuni Baisakhi, the ballad written after the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. I now invite our esteemed speakers to begin the session. Thank you.
Thank you, and a warm welcome to the front lawns and to this wonderful feast of ideas, opinions, deliberations. There's no shortage of any of them. I've been here for the last 2.5 days, and I've participated and witnessed several discussions on West Asia, on Israel, on the Palestinian issue. And I thought that maybe to start with, we can maybe zoom out and take a larger picture view on the region before coming back to this issue. Um, although we've been discussing the region, there's always new stuff because it's a very happening part of the world. and so we will come to several of the more recent developments as well. But if you look at the last few months in particular, post October 7, you've had the Israeli attacks, not just against Hamas, which is probably a militarily weakened entity, although not as dead as the Israelis would like it to be. Hezbollah, which has definitely been weakened by the targeted assassination of many of its leaders, and the what you might call innovative approach of setting off some thousands of pagers in people's hands and pockets and incapacitating them in various ways. Syria has had a dramatic change within the space of 2 weeks. A family that had ruled the country with an iron fist for 52 years, the Assad dynasty is gone. And Iran, which had created this strong axis of resistance, extending all the way into Lebanon, suddenly finds that the land bridge to Lebanon, which was Syria, is no longer a country that it controls. So there's a lot that's been going on. People are tempted to think that with Trump coming back into power, is there a reset underway to the Middle East? There's very enthusiastic discourse about a grand deal where the Saudis will normalize relations with Israel. But guess what? The Saudis are saying, yeah, good idea. We don't have any problem with it, but show us a pathway and a timeline to a Palestinian state, and we are ready to do the deal that you want. So what does that mean? That it still comes back to the Palestinian issue, even though there's this larger reset that you're talking about. So the centrality of Palestine in the region cannot be dismissed, even though there is always this temptation from the Abraham Accords and the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor and so on to create these grand architectures. So within that framework, I wanted to start with Lindy, because it really did start with the Brits, that in 1917, you had the Balfour Declaration, and as the Jewish Hungarian writer Arthur Koestler said famously, it was a solemn promise by one country to give away a second country to a third country. And that's partly what's led to the situation that we are in today. So, Lindy, let me start with you. You don't have to bear the entire burden for the previous 100 years. We won't ask you to take responsibility for Sykes-Picot and Syria either, but please.
So thank you very much indeed, Navtej. And of course, as somebody who's from Northern Ireland, but the British High Commissioner to India, I'm familiar with the need to understand and empathise with where we come from in order to try and understand the present. But I think you're right that we are at a real inflection point in the Middle East at the moment. I spent much of my early career working in the Middle East, whether it was in Baghdad, as the director of our humanitarian aid to the region, as the person responsible for trying to scale up our aid program into Syria at a point where we had very limited access early in the conflict. And I go back to the number of times I thought it couldn't get any worse. I thought it was as bad as it could be. But I think the last couple of years have just really made me stand back and reflect on the scale of the challenge. And I think you're right in many ways that the centrality of the situation in the Palestinian territories is absolutely key to that. And of course, we're not just, I think, at an inflection point, but I think we're also at a point of very serious fragility. So we have got, thank goodness, a ceasefire at the moment in Gaza, but that ceasefire is fragile. It is absolutely essential that it is implemented in full as fast as possible by both sides, because the number of people suffering is extraordinary. 90% of Gazans displaced, often more than once. 46,000 Palestinians killed. It is an extraordinarily unimaginable scale of humanitarian suffering. So what we must do first is get to a point where that suffering stops and where the situation is stabilized. But then we must be able to imagine a future which takes this moment of horror and opportunity to think about where we can go in the future. And I think that the only solution remains political, but it has been so difficult to imagine what that looks like. And you are right. I think that in particular, the Saudi government has been very clear that there are ways this could change, but there are conditions that come with that. And I think their voice will be key in the same way that actually in the ceasefire, the role of the Egyptians, of the Qataris, of the US was absolutely key in bringing the parties to the table. So this will require all of us to imagine a future which is more peaceful, but imagine a future which we can't wish away some of the fundamental challenges, where it is that more than one group of people has a claim to land, more than one group of people has an attachment to a territory. That is something we must resolve through politics, because it cannot be resolved through violence.
Is the UK still relevant to a solution?
So I think every country in the region is. We've committed £130 million of humanitarian aid in the Palestinian territories in the last year. I think it requires all of us to commit to sustaining, frankly, food, water, access in Gaza at the moment. That's something none of us can do individually. So yes, I think we are absolutely relevant, and indeed I think it takes a collective effort to get to a point where we can imagine a future.
Thank you. Selma, I wanted to come to you, and I wanted to come to the lawyer rather than the writer in you today. Finally, the year 2024 seemed to see the international legal community get out of its comatose sort of state. Maybe we can thank the South Africans for taking the matter to the ICJ. But you've had two fairly dramatic moments over the last year. The first, 14 out of 15 ICJ judges, including Justice Dalveer Bhandari, who our government nominated to the ICJ, gave a very clear ruling that Israel's occupation of Gaza, the West Bank, and Jerusalem is illegal, and it kind of obliged all countries who are members to act in certain ways, and asked on Israel to not only vacate the occupation and take out the settlers, but also pay reparations. Then you had the ICC ruling on the genocide case, where ICJ ruling as well on the genocide case, where remarkably they've asked, the ICC has issued arrest warrants for Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. How do you see these things from the perspective of both a lawyer and a British Palestinian?
Thank you, and I'd like to, just before I answer your question, thank again the Jaipur Literature Festival and also possibly the government of India for hosting me here and for platforming me as a Palestinian at times when there's been a deplatforming of Palestinian voices and a censorship of those who speak out in support of our cause. So just to put that in first, thank you. So there are basically three key events of 2024. Two at the ICJ, which is concerned with the relationship between states, and one at the ICC, which is a newer body which is looking to prosecute individuals for war crimes. The ICJ, you have the finding of a plausible case of genocide against Israel. 14 out of 15 judges, as you say, found in favor of that ruling. The one judge, Navdeep, I think her name is, from Uganda, who did not agree with the one sort of outlier in that judgment, for reasons that even her government, I don't think, understood, has since been promoted. So that's somehow, she's higher up. It sort of has paid off that she was such an outlier. But that judgment was very key in terms of not just, people sometimes say international law has failed because it isn't being applied, because these rules aren't being listened to. But I think you have to look at sometimes the impact that it has on building a movement around it, which can inspire people between states and a way of vocalizing a quest for justice. And it did that, and it has also brought in like the Irish and other states who are joining up with that movement. And it clearly sets out, and it puts the word of genocide, itemizing it against the situation in Gaza. The second ICJ case was less sort of televisable, less dramatic, but it was potentially more important. And the human rights lawyers that in the Palestinians like Raji Sourani that I know have said that this is the advisory opinion of July was probably more important in terms of the scope of it, in terms of what it was saying about the illegality of the occupation and the call for reparations, and the demand for Israel to withdraw from the occupied Palestinian territories within a year. It also set front and center the idea of racial segregation, and that this was that the actions of Israel tied in with violated the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. So those were the two main ICJ. Then with the ICC, you have the arrest warrants for two Israelis, two high-profile Israelis, Netanyahu and Gallant, and then three Palestinians, who two of whom at least have been killed, as to my knowledge. So it took a long time for the ICC to issue those arrest warrants. And in that period, there was, if you compare it to Ukraine, where the ICC had a team flying out to Kiev within a month or so, and having people on the ground investigating the crimes, and the whole system went into action very fast. In Palestine, it's always a very different matter. There's always a kind of exceptionalism, but we're pleased as to where the courts have been, and we just hope that the people and the politicians and those with influence will back those rulings and to give them some teeth.
Kevin, Ireland's been an outlier. You've spoken loud and clear on Gaza. You've also joined the case with South Africa at the ICJ. You have also taken quite a backlash from Israel for the steps that you announced. Tell me, what makes Ireland the outlier in Europe when compared with, say, UK or Germany or other countries? And is it your history? Is it your leadership? Is it popular? Are you concerned that it could make things more complicated for Ireland?
Thank you very much. You've asked a lot of questions there, so I hope I'll remember them all. Well, first of all, I'll say I'm very proud of our foreign policy stance on this. It has been consistent for many, many years. What I would say to you is that quite unusually for us, we're a small country on the most western periphery of Europe. And so we are surrounded by a big neighbor, and we're surrounded by big countries within the EU. But this is one issue, the issue of the problems in the Middle East, that is not just considered as a foreign policy issue. It's a domestic policy. It's that level of support from right across the political spectrum. So so basically this is there are no dissenting voices really in terms of the political actors, left, right or center, in terms of our position. And that's why, even though it took us some time, but we did make the decision last year with Norway and Spain to recognize Palestine. And we did that in a very thoughtful way because we felt that that was needed to be done to give some hope to the idea of a two-state solution. You asked why, what's behind this? Well, of course, quite obviously, we have a long history of being a colony, of colonialism, of conflict on our island, of partition, of peace building. We have a very imperfect peace in Northern Ireland, but it has a peace that has sustained since the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. And compromise was necessary on all sides. So, in a way, it's an area where we can walk the talk because we have lived through some of that experience. So, I think that definitely that history of being the underdog, of being in a country that has experienced conflict, does influence how Irish people look at the issue in a very principled way. Sometimes, you know, it's rather lazily described as a rise of anti-Semitism or anti-Israeli policy, and we completely reject that characterization because all we're doing is really trying to, in a very determined and respectful way, to get Israel to stand through to the ideals on which itself was founded as a state. And that's very much where we're coming from. So we very much reject that kind of label. So does it bring risks, I think was your question. Of course, none of these things are without cost. I don't think we want to be an outlier in the EU. And I'm happy to say that there are a number of EU member states, like Spain most recently. Sweden recognized Palestine before we did. So there is a strong body of support. But I think you have correctly alluded to the fact that there have been some divisions. But so that's why, as well, we want to be very strong in terms of the work that we do in Brussels, at the European Council, to very much put forward our view. Is it risky? There are costs, of course, potential costs in all of this, and I think we'd be naive to do that. But I think so far, at least, we've been able to hold true to this principled position. I think we cannot say that we have a values-based foreign policy and then refuse to act any differently than what we've done. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Gideon, you've, over the last couple of days, moved many of our audiences with your anguish and pain and your compassion over developments in Gaza and in the occupied West Bank. I want to see whether we can take a more looking forward than looking backward view. I've been following some discourse which says that even though everybody, including India, the UK, the US, Ireland, the UN, everybody speaks of a two-state solution, actually there is no realistic pathway to one given all that is happening with the settlements and so on. There are some people who say, look beyond the box and see, is a one-state solution possible where all citizens, Palestinian and Israeli and Jewish and Arab, have equal rights? Is that a possibility? Or if there's no two-state solution, we are condemned to look at a one state with two people in an apartheid sort of state situation? How do you create a way forward from where we are?
I'm again the wrong person in the wrong time, in the wrong place. If you brought me to come up with a hope in those very, very dark days, it's really hard to imagine, but we have to. This year, I'm not sure that we all digested what happened both to the Palestinian people and to the Israeli people. It's more obvious what happened to the Palestinian people. It's more obvious to understand how much hatred did Israel establish wherever it acted, in Gaza, in Lebanon. How else can it be? It will take generations for those who went through this war in Gaza to rehabilitate, if at all, to find a way to heal, because I'm sure that none of us here, really none of us, can even imagine himself what did the people of Gaza went through in this year. In the same time, there were also many changes in Israel. Most of the Israelis, if not all of them, after the 7th of October, with all the crimes and the atrocities there, came to the conclusion that from now on Israel has the right to do whatever it wants. And they are implementing it. And how? Most of the Israelis, including some of my best friends and members of the peace camp and the leftists and the intellectuals, lost, and they declare it, lost any interest in what's going on in Palestine. They should be blamed. They brought it upon themselves. No empathy anymore, no humanity. Expressing empathy in Israel to Gaza is almost criminal. People were fired, especially if they are not Jewish. People lost their jobs. People were even arrested only for expressing some kind of empathy to this horrible, horrible horror show that we are witnessing there. So from this point to go forward and to see sunrise is really almost impossible, because both peoples are now maybe in the lowest point ever in terms of believing in peace or in any kind of settlement, in terms of trust, in terms of perceiving the other side as human beings. But having said this, we have an expression in Hebrew, I'm sure it's in many other languages, that the darkest part of the night is always the last one before dawn. And maybe, you know, we used to say that in the Middle East we should be realistic enough to believe in miracles. So maybe that's the time to be realistic enough to believe in miracles. Concretely to your question. The two-state solution is the best solution. Two peoples are struggling over one piece of land. Let's divide the land and have one Palestinian state, one Jewish state side by side, good relations, and Messiah had arrived. The only problem is that that's a train that left the station a long time ago. And we have to realize it. And the problem is that nobody is ready to realize it. Because after realizing it, you stand with a limbo. Where do you go from here? Any one of you who had traveled in the West Bank, and there are some of you who had been there, know very well that there is no room left for a Palestinian state. The settlers won. The settlers took any possible part of the land and took it over by force, illegally, but the state was supporting them, the armies protected them, and there is no room for a Palestinian state. There is only a room for a Bantustan, and a Bantustan will not solve anything. But for the world, it's too hard to digest. And here, if I may say so, the two-state solution is the biggest damage now, because everyone says two-state solution. And, you know, he paid his role. We have a solution on the shelf. We will use it one day, not today, obviously, because there is no partners, not yesterday, because there were no partners, sometime in the future, and our conscience is totally clean. We have the solution, we will wait for the right time. And meanwhile, generation after generation after generation of Palestinians are living under these criminal conditions, both in the West Bank and Gaza, without any perspectives. So the first thing should be now to realize that with all the goodwill, with all the efforts to believe in the two-state solution, the settlers or Israel or both won, and it's irreversible. Nobody is going to evacuate 700,000 settlers. Is it just? No. But is it realistic to believe that Israel will evacuate the settlements? No. Is it realistic to believe the United States will push Israel to evacuate the settlers? Look backwards. All the American administrations lived in peace with the settlements, except of a hollow lip service about the illegality and so forth. And here I come to the alternative. If we all will realize that the two-state solution is non-existing, at least we will have to start to think what is the alternative. And there are only two alternatives. I don't see a third one. I'll be so happy to be convinced there is a third one. The two only alternatives realistically are either an apartheid state forever or a democracy. I don't see a third opportunity. Now, apartheid forever, I don't have to tell you, what does it mean? We have the apartheid already with us, but once we establish it as the official regime of Israel and Palestine between the river and the sea, obviously there will be many consequences. Hopefully there will be international consequences, like South Africa faced consequences which brought the apartheid to fall. Democracy means living many of our dreams. The dream about a Palestinian state, the dream about the Jewish state, Zionism, the dreams of many, many Jews in the world to have a state of their own, the dream of many Palestinians to have their own state. But in the same time, it offers some kind of vision. This basic thing of equality, the most basic value of any democracy, which is fairer today in Israel and Palestine than anything else. There is nothing more in the opposite side of the nature of the conflict than equality. Zionism is Jewish supremacy, obviously. The Palestinians in any level cannot feel a beginning of equality, not a single level in the daily life, in the political life, in the cultural life, in their rights, in their citizenship, which they don't have, the only people in the world without a citizenship, so many fields. We have to start there. Right now it sounds far-fetched. People are laughing at me when I mention it, but then they become more serious when I ask them, so what do you suggest? And then we are remained with apartheid state. And I don't know a worse regime rather than apartheid.
Thank you for the strong words. Lindy, after what Selma explained about the ICC and the ICJ, do you think Prime Minister Netanyahu can travel to London, or would he have to be arrested?
I'm not going to speculate on future scenarios, but the UK will stick with its international obligations.
So 125 countries, including the UK, will stick by their international obligations, okay? I said that there's a lot that's been happening in the last week in particular. President Trump, among his zillion and a half executive orders, issued one which creates a whole new legal ecosystem for anti-Semitism. And it kind of, I don't know whether it's meant to shut down all campus protests, but if you look at the language, in India, our favorite word for it would be draconian. It's a word that we love to use. And I wanted to start with Selma on this, that this whole business of widening the scope of anti-Semitism to a point where you blur the distinguish between a legitimate and fair criticism or attempt to stop anti-Jewish or indeed anti-Muslim or anti-Hindu or any other anti-protests, that's legitimate. But is it equal to extending the same definition to anything that goes against the current government of Israel or the actions of the government? What does it do for university campuses, Middle East specialists, people who are devoting their lifetimes to studying the region?
Thank you. Thanks for the question. I mean, these developments are really worrying in terms of the broadening and the criminalizing of anti-Semitism, which is going on, but it's not new. It's been happening for a long time, and most of it, the roots of it, come from this International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which does blur within the examples the affiliation of anti-Semitism with criticism of Israel, with equating Israel to genocide or making any connection there. Now, what this can mean if it's adopted, and it's been pushed very heavily by the British government, for examples, on British universities. At one point, there was a not so veiled threat to withdraw funding to universities who did not adopt this definition, which led to a lot of unrest and discontent among academia and students. But it has been taken on in quite a few universities, and some of the academics, they don't really know how to interpret it. Because I give you one example, like a Middle East studies course, which is in a Scottish university, they wanted to use the Human Rights Watch reports on apartheid and the Amnesty International reports on apartheid in Israel. But because it's a criticism of Israel, they were sort of advised to drop them from the course curriculum. Now, if you're teaching Middle East studies and you can basically criticize every country in the region except for the one which potentially and arguably and in a very documented way has a very systematic system of apartheid going on, has also attacked, has invaded Lebanon, Syria, and bombed Yemen, but that country, that one country, cannot be singled out or cannot be criticized. You're making a mockery out of that whole area, that whole area of studies. And then the other way that it has this very broad chill factor around it, of people sort of just moving their studies away from Palestine, moving their studies away from the incredibly rich legacy of Edward Said that you find has influenced so much of post-colonial thinking in academia, not just in the US, but across Europe. And so you've got this closing down of spaces. And I would say, if you want to look at freedom in Western societies at the moment, the litmus test is always Palestine. Palestine is at the kernel. And then around that, you have post-colonial studies. Around that, you have this idea of woke studies. And when they start to be attacked, and there's normally a good blend of Islamophobia in there, when they start to be attacked, other freedoms will go as well. But I think the developments in the US, particularly against campus protests, even without this executive order, have been so heavy-handed, so vicious, so militarized. I mean, one friend told me that at Indiana University, they had snipers on the roof, like directed against students who were protesting against a genocide. I mean, it's like a kind of parody of freedom. You know, it's grotesque what's happening, and it's now being accelerated all under the guise, as the most horrific things often are, of doing something good and wonderful and looking after and being protective towards the people who have got a long history of oppression. And nothing I am saying is in any way taking away from the absolute need to police real anti-Semitism very carefully. And just to add one point, which perhaps is more to be taken up by someone of the Jewish faith rather than myself, but it really does reduce down what being Jewish, I mean, this is what my Jewish friends say, and academics, it reduces down the nature of being Jewish from being a religion, from being a festivity, from being like a long heritage full of all kinds of things, just down to the being bound to the non-questioning support of a state which is getting increasingly fascist and pariah in the region.
Gideon, if we go back a little bit in history, until the 20th century, there was a long history of persecution of Jewish communities. But most of that persecution happened in Europe, and most of it happened by Christians, not by Arabs or Muslims. In fact, you had thriving Jewish communities in Baghdad and Tehran and Shiraz and Damascus and Cairo and Rabat and all over, and in Bombay and in Cochin. So Jewish communities had flourished throughout history in these other places. As somebody from that community, the point that Selma ended with, are you worried that when we start describing anti-Semitism and targeting it almost in certain directions, we are forgetting the history and going into potentially dangerous new directions?
Absolutely, and it's not only about the past, it's mainly about the present. And let me be very clear, anti-Semitism exists. Anti-Semitism is much more popular today than 1.5 years ago. Anti-Semitism should be fought. Having said all this, we have to be much more careful about freedom of speech and about manipulating us. And we are manipulated, and let's face it. I'll give one example and then I'll answer you. When the General Secretary of the UN dared to say after the 7th of October that the 7th of October has a context, Israel has labeled him immediately as an anti-Semite. The 7th of October has a context. This is all what he said. He didn't justify it by all means. He didn't say anything but saying there is a context. Isn't there a context? What did we think? That 18 years in a cage will bring Israel prosperity and security? 18 years of Gaza in a cage. Now came the attack of Israel on Gaza, which is now 15 months going on, with all the figures that you all know them, the babies, the children, the women, the destruction. I will not go to it because you all know the figures and the dimensions of it. And all of a sudden Israel speaks about the context. There is a context, 7th of October. We had to retaliate. We had to punish them. We had to kill them. We have to destroy Gaza. What did you expect of the 7th of October? That's the context. We didn't do it out of the blue sky. We were the victims of the 7th of October. And then we went to the attack. All of a sudden, talking about the context is legitimate. All of a sudden, talking about the context is not anti-Semitism, but pro-Israeli. Coming to your question, it's now many years or few years that the Israeli propaganda changed its strategy, and it didn't start on the 7th of October. It started like a few years ago under this current government, namely to label any criticism about the occupation, about the apartheid, about Israel, about the government as anti-Semitism. We criminalized any kind of consciousness. We criminalized any kind of basic moral criticism. Do you really think that there can be a moral person in the world, a man or woman of conscience, that can witness those scenes in Gaza and not blame Israel for them? How can it be possible? I don't understand it. How can it be possible to remain indifferent or to remain silent? How can we be silent? How can we ask the world to be silent after the silence of the world in World War II, when we blamed, rightly so, the silence of the world? So we shouldn't give up on this. I think it's more your case than mine, because it's really about freedom of speech. We shouldn't let this happen. Criticism about moral questions like genocide, ethnic cleansing, mass killing, destruction, everything like this is not our right. It is our duty. It has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. There are anti-Semites who are using it. It surely increases anti-Semitism. And if you want to fight this kind of anti-Semitism, you should first of all change your policy in Gaza, because Gaza fuels anti-Semitism. I remember the years of Oslo, when Israel seemed to be very peaceful. Nobody spoke about anti-Semitism. There was no anti-Semitism. The world hugged Israel. Where were the anti-Semites there? So let's remember, we have the right, we have the duty to react to what we see, to listen to what our conscience say, to listen to what any logic says. And what is happening in Gaza in the last year or so is criminal, and we have the right to say so, and nobody can blame us for being anti-Semites when we, at least part of us, know very well that we are not anti-Semites. We are only concerned about this horrible, horrible catastrophe in Gaza.
I think we have time for one last question, and that's on an important, again, recent development. It's less than 48 hours back that Israel's ban on the UN Relief and Work, Refugees and Work Agency, UNRWA, came into effect, effectively stopping its operations in the occupied territories. We have two experts with us who've handled the humanitarian aspects of international diplomacy from different vantage points. Maybe I'll start with Lindy. You've done a lot of work in this area. What does the ban on UNRWA mean on the ground for Palestinians who are looking for some relief after the ceasefire?
So I think the question is, what is the alternative? I mean, the UK is incredibly proud of the fact that we have given, I think it's £41 million to UNRWA this year. You know, I've been to schools, to hospitals in Gaza before the current conflict and seen the scale of services they were able to provide, but also seen the influence they had on ensuring that things like curricula took into account the wide range of views in the region. They were incredibly important, and they remain so. I don't see the alternative, and I think they were a vital part of both humanitarian aid, but also the hope for an education system, a healthcare system, and others before the conflict. I think there has to be a way forward that sees them as part of the future.
Kevin?
Thank you. I'll be very brief because fully agree with what Lindy said. Ireland is also a long-term supporter of UNRWA. We have maintained our funding throughout, even when other countries cut their funding. They play an irreplaceable role. I've seen it myself in Gaza and in the West Bank. And just as Lindy said, they have to be part of the future in terms of the responding to this terrible humanitarian crisis, which is just before us now. Thank you.
Cutting the aid to UNRWA is the continuance of a long-standing policy in which the victim is punished again and again.
So you want to?
Yes, I just want to say, the cutting of aid to UNRWA is horrific, and it needs to be maintained and supported, and it's a lifeline for so many Palestinians. But I also want to say that since October 2023, I don't think we've ever seen humanitarian aid being used quite so cynically as it has been over Palestine. And when it's combined with supporting the military, whilst mainly with the US, that issue with the peer, when you're saying that you're providing humanitarian aid, but in fact it's a guise for other things. It's really there's been a deliberate blurring of lines, which is putting a lot of lives at risk, and I think that has to be averted, and we need to be aware of how those dynamics work as well. But yes, all support to UNRWA.
So let me open this up to our wonderful audience. I see a lot of hands. Okay, the lady in the front. Mike is coming to you.
I wanted to ask, how do you feel about the connection of Israel supporters at the same time also being anti-Semitic, as we saw recently with Elon Musk doing the Nazi salute, or was Donald Trump supporting the Proud Boys? Doesn't this, one go against the other?
Who wants to take that? Go ahead,
I think the alliance between the current Israeli government and a lot of very right-wing, genuinely anti-Semitic forces has been going on for a long time. Orban in Hungary being one example. And it's, the traditionally far right seems to be going to bed quite easily with the Israeli government. If I was Jewish, I would be extremely worried about this. I think I would want to really distance myself as far as possible. I mean, Gideon, come in on this. I feel it's a sort of more
I keep on repeating, there is anti-Semitism. It should be fought. The anti-Semitism right now, its main fuel is Israel's policy and Israel's behavior. If you want to really fight it, you have to change the policy. And beside this, not every critic of Israel is coming from anti-Semitic emotions. More than this, most of them come from a genuine place of not being able to accept this reality and to watch those scenes and to remain apathetical and say, no, that's like a earthquake, you know, a force majeure that happened to the Palestinian people. Nobody should be taken accountable. Nobody should be blamed. It's, you know,
Okay.
by nature.
Kevin, you wanted to add something? No. Okay, I'm going to take 3 quick questions. Gentleman in the maroon shirt, yes, sir, you first, and then the gentleman in the black turban.
Nobody is actually addressing the elephant in the room. The US is joined at the hip with Israel. Unless this hip is broken, no solution is going to come. And once is US.
Do you have a question?
Yes, the question is, when will this happen?
Okay. Gentleman in the black turban.
Thank you so much. After the Rwandan and the Bosnian genocides, a lot of research literature was dedicated to evaluating the failure of the UN to stop these genocides. However, the failure of the international institution to stop the Gazan genocide against the will of a hegemon, the US, that went to great lengths to justify Israel act, renders international law
Question.
and these institutions. So are they even relevant anymore? And the other quick question is, how much is the disproportionate response in the prolonged occupation is a reflection of Netanyahu's clash with the Israeli Supreme Court?
Okay. Kevin, why don't you take that?
Okay, I'll just take the one on the international community. And I can understand the degree of frustration with the paralysis within the UN Security Council and the way in which the UN has dealt with being able to, or being paralyzed from dealing with a number of big crises such as Syria, Ukraine, Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. But I would just say that I would not give up on the international architecture is there. I know it's a cliche to say that if we didn't have it, we would struggle to create it. So the fact that, as has been said by Selma, that the ICJ is being used as an instrument in an international court of law to look at this issue should be welcomed. The fact that the International Criminal Court is also investigating is something that we as state parties need to support. So I understand the frustration, but we do need to operate within this. If we don't, therein chaos lies.
And if I can just say quickly on the role of the US, the US is key to any future. The US was critical to reaching a ceasefire in Gaza, and fragile as it is, we all need that ceasefire to hold. So the US will remain key, partly because of its relationship with Israel, to a peaceful future.
Thank you. We are out of time. I wish we had more time. There were lots of questions, but a big hand for our wonderful panel who've spoken clearly and honestly on this very difficult issue.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's give it up once more for our speakers Lindy Cameron, Kevin Kelly, Gideon Levy, Selma Dabbagh, and Navdeep Suri for sharing their powerful insights on the Middle East and what it means to have a path of hope and equity. Thank you so much.
So livid. No, and it's been instrumentalized. And it's
like, you know, all the BBC reports were like, we're sending humanitarian. It's like, yes, bloody drones. What happened is genocide.
how they can just shut down.
Thank you, Gideon. Bye-bye. Where are you going?
No, not going, just